Welcome back to another video where I at least attempt to make original Pokemon Idle Animations. You've probably heard this part already if you watched any of the previous videos in this series, but for those of you that are new here, the premise is very simple. I create new Idle Animations of Pokemon that you all suggest in the comments. Speaking of comments, the first Pokemon I mentioned was Whimsicott, which funnily enough, two of you actually suggested the same Pokemon. I'm actually glad to see Whimsicott because it's a Pokemon whose design I really like, with the whole sentient cotton fairy aesthetic going on. With Whimsicott's composition in mind, I knew beforehand that I wanted Whimsicott to have a very floaty feeling for the idle animation. I started the Whimsicott animation with a simple ascending movement that gets Whimsicott higher into the air and shows off its pseudo flight characteristic. I had to make Whimsicott go up in a slowish movement so that it would have a floaty appearance even with this simple action. Then to add to it, I animated the scale value so that Whimsicott would squish itself as it rose in elevation, which I think looks pretty good so far. After getting Whimsicott comfortably into the air, I then transitioned to the next part of the idle animation, where it glides in place as if it is riding the wind around it in a direct reference to its Pokédex entry, which wasn't something hard to include in the idle animation. For this next part, at first I wanted to have Whimsicott floating around the room and acting like a whimsical individual, if you would. Look, I don't make these puns on purpose, they just kinda happen. However, the idea I came up with just wasn't forming as I initially struggled with implementing it, even doing just random stuff like this. Yeah, I'm not too impressed with this either. I then decided that in order to make this work, I needed to condense it down to a few actions, but to be as efficient as I can with the reduced number of animations. What I mean is to add more detail but with less time spent getting to the intended result. I accomplished this by only having Whimsicott move to 2 areas instead of 4 to 5 like I did originally. This made the process a lot smoother as I only had to focus on a few animations rather than just trying to refine a larger number of animations at once. Within this sequence, I added this rapid waving motion with its arms to showcase Whimsicott giving off an excited expression while smiling and floating around. This was easy to do by just rotating its arms up and down for 2 poses and just pretty much spamming it throughout the timeline, with the keyframe timing being 2 frames apart so that the movement will be quick. As Whimsicott is floating around, I had it spinning around while still making the transition from each spot look like a floaty cotton ball of energy. Now I could add in a sort of effect that can have Whimsicott spreading cotton as it flies around. The easiest way for me to do it would be through a particle emitter, which is something I've used in many of my previous animations, so it's something I'm familiar with yet something I don't fully understand. That doesn't matter though, what I need to understand is how I'm going to go about creating the emitter. Now that I think about it, I could technically just make Whimsicott the particle emitter itself. Before that, I need to figure out the object to be emitted that will replicate cotton spreading around. I make this little cotton ball that will be the source object that will be emitted from the particle emitter slash Whimsicott. All I have to do is tweak some settings on this particle emitter and there we go. Whimsicott can now spread cotton wherever it goes. Now I just need to do a few small things to round out the animation, and with that, here's the completed Whimsicott idle animation. I'm actually really happy on how this came out as the animation contains sporadic movements while still keeping its floaty identity. When animating a floaty Pokemon like Whimsicott, I had to be careful with the timing, as if it was too fast it wouldn't really fit for the animation. But I do think it ended up working out fine for this one. Whimsicott was a great start, but let's move on to the next Pokemon for today. The next comment for today mentions Scrafty. Scrafty's most obvious physical features is the mohawk on top, and more importantly, its makeshift pants. At least I think those are pants. Yeah, I'm gonna call them pants. So I decided to create the idle animation around that concept. Now I will admit, I did use the in-game idle animation for inspiration here, but I did include a part that separates it from that animation. The only part of the original idle animation I used was the part where Scrafty tugs on its pants. Look, there's not much to work with for Scrafty here. I even tried using the hood thing on the back of his scarf, but I don't think it was meant to fit over its head as the giant mohawk gets in the way of that. Anyways, for the first half of the idle animation, I animated some head movement to lean back and forth while it's pulling its pants up and down lightly. Just some simple rotation manipulation for the movement of its upper body, while the slight pants pull is just animating the 2 ends of the pants to go up and down, using the location keyframes while the arms move accordingly to look like it has a grip on the pants. This whole process wasn't too complicated. However, that is where the next part comes in. Since I mentioned earlier that I needed a way to not make this idle animation feel like an exact copy of the original in-game one, I actually came up with the idea of having Scrafty stretch its pants to the limit. Now it won't be something over-exaggerated like the pants going past its own head or anything like that, but an animation to show discomfort, or more specifically, a way to show that Scrafty has a visible problem with the pants being stuck in place. Look, there's only so many things I could have come up with that could be interesting enough for an idle animation, as its Pokédex entries aren't doing me any favors this time. I don't think spitting acidic acid from its mouth will make sense for a wait, actually, that could have worked. But I think the rest of the animation I came up with is a little more creative than that. After Scrafty pulls on its pants a few times, the next pull accidentally throws itself onto the ground. Which the only annoying part about animating this was the timing on getting Scrafty to fling itself down and the pants pulling animation at the same time. After a little trial and error, I got the motion to work, which since this is an idle animation, it has to loop back to the beginning, which means I couldn't just leave Scrafty on the ground. For that, I just had Scrafty lean backwards to then hop off the ground and land on its 2 feet to stand back up and restart the idle animation from there. I did do a few extra animations like making the hood thing move depending on how Scrafty moved. I also animated the eyelids. No, I don't have a recording for this because of the fact that it took me nearly an entire hour for it to work. Don't ask me how that happened, it just didn't. That's enough of that though. Here is the full Scrafty idle animation. This Scrafty animation is one of my more simpler ones, but something that still shows off some personality for Scrafty, even if it was due to a wardrobe malfunction. As for the animation process for Scrafty, I didn't really do anything too crazy, as it was more just making sure each segment of the animation looked good. Even though this was the easiest animation to finish out of the 3 in this video, it was still an interesting Pokemon to work with. With that said, I think it's time we move to the last Pokemon in this video. The final Pokemon for this video is Munna. Munna, unlike the other 2, was a completely different process as it was a creative challenge, or should I say struggle, to gather ideas for the idle animation. I'll explain that more in detail in a little bit. For now, I'm going to talk about the beginning part of the idle animation. Munna as a Pokemon doesn't have too many features, noticeably even less than Scrafty, which only had pants. So I landed on having Munna levitate around in the air while curling itself inward as Munna rises and falls while in the air. I also animated its arms and legs to sort of incline towards the center of its body to give it more depth for the up and down movement that is honestly very basic at its core. We now have a solid foundation for Munna's idle animation, but I want to add one more thing to it. I mentioned it very briefly earlier, but for Munna it was actually harder to come up with a good idea even with looking at the Pokédex entries. I couldn't really use these in the idle animation at first. This was because of the wording and how Munna is a dream-eating Pokemon, and it wouldn't make sense to just have a random person or Pokemon appear from Munna to eat its dreams. However, I did come up with a workaround. I just decided to completely throw logic out the window on this one. Instead of going with a direct reference of Munna eating someone else's dreams while being physically right beside them, as stated in the Pokédex entry, I opted for a more looser interpretation by having Munna eat dreams from its far surroundings, like a Bluetooth connection or a 5G cellular tower thanks to its psychic powers. Look, I know this sounds incredibly dumb and inaccurate, but it's either that or just Munna floating around in place for the remainder of the idle animation. So yeah, I'll be working with this plan in mind. The intro I'm using is the one that talks about how when Munna eats dreams, it releases mist. The mist was something that I had to create myself from scratch. This time I'm going to be using a particle emitter again, which means I need to make an object for the particle emitter to produce. Unlike the Whimsicott animation, instead of cotton balls, I need to create an object that when emitted in large numbers at a time, it will look like smoke or mist. There is another way to make smoke in Blender, but simulations are something I tend to avoid, since if I did try to use a simulation, this video would never come out. Potential CPU burning methods aside, I took an icosphere and subdivided it, applied a displace modifier to give it this shape. Then I went to the shaders and started connecting textures so I would eventually get this semi-transparent puffy look. Now we put this into the particle emitter and add a wind force field that just basically pushes the particles, which can be customized depending on what you need. I'm not the person to explain how that works, just know that it's what helps the mist get pushed upwards. Now that the emitter is set up, the Pokédex entry mentioned that the mist can either be pink or black depending on the dream. So I just keyframed the color of the object to change to black to show that. Afterwards, I just had the mist fade out with the transparency, which was similar to what I did in my previous fainting animation with Basque Legion. Okay, that was a long explanation, so here's the Munna idle animation. Munna's idle animation was a bit of a stretch logic-wise, but the animation itself isn't as bad as the justification I made up for it. Now, but seriously, for the mist animation, I went with 2 identical particle emitters coming out from both sides of Munna, as one stream of mist didn't look as good as 2 of them being there. The mist itself came out a lot better than I thought it would, especially with the pink glow that I added. Honestly, I was going to go in a slightly different direction with it, but I think I want to save that idea for Musharna, its evolution, which might be one I do in the future. The idle animations are always a good time as I can make my ideas into a real thing, well, about as real as it gets for being in a YouTube video. As usual, please leave your suggestions down below for which Pokemon you want to see me try to make an idle animation for. If you enjoyed this video, it will be greatly appreciated if you liked and subscribed if you aren't already, as you will know when any of my content drops on the channel. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.